be learning how to do a still life project together. Um, I already told the Drawing One kids that joined in about this. I had a Drawing One class this morning, so they were free to leave because this first part is the same. For those of you that have me for Drawing One later, either on Wednesday or Thursday, or potentially, I don't think I have another one on a day. No, I don't. It would. So if you have me for Drawing One and you didn't have it this morning, you would have it on Wednesday or Thursday. Just a heads up that this first section of the lesson is the same, but the rest of it will be very different. You are welcome to use what you do today for Drawing One, but again, there will be a point in the lesson where I tell you like specifically about the objects that you're picking. You need to be aware of what are my drawing skills because or what are my painting skills because the objects that I pick, I need to remember that I'm actually going to have to draw or paint these. And so you're going to want to be very aware of your abilities. You want to pick something that's going to push you a little bit, but not so much that you're going to want to quit the class. So just be aware of that so that when we progress through the lesson today and we start actually like picking objects and painting them and getting them set up and whatever, that you don't pick something that's going to be too hard. All right, so at this point, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to pull up the lesson. Quick reminder to always check your home page to see like the weekly assignments. So joining the Zoom lesson is the first thing, and then make sure you finish discussion 1 by the end of the week. And we are starting discussion 2 today. We are starting our lesson. There will be a assignment associated with what we're doing today, and that needs to be done by Saturday this week. If you forgot to get art supplies, try and do that as soon as you can. And then as always, if you need help, please contact me as soon as you can. So we're going to jump right into our first project, which is learning about still life. And it's a really good project for beginning level art students for both drawing and painting, which is why we are doing this project in both classes. However, I would highly suggest you do different objects for each class to keep it interesting, as well as just it makes for more interesting compositions. So at this point, to keep things flowing well, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. There will be parts at which I will stop and take a look and see if everyone's still on the same page. And then there will be some time at the end as well to either stay connected and ask some one-on-one questions with me or to go ahead and actually start working on the project. So any questions before I jump into this? Because I'll take about 5 to 10 minutes to get through some of this. Any questions? All right, okay, let's jump into it. Okay, so at the beginning of this presentation, after this lesson has finished, there will be a recording of this lesson on the front. Right now, it's just a short description summary of what's going on in this. But in case you're worried about me going too fast, again, this is being recorded and I'll upload it to this page. But here's a short description of what's expected of you. We're going to learn how to set up and paint our own still life painting. If you are unsure of what still life is, we're going to be talking about that as well. But basically, I'm sure all of you have seen artwork before, and you've probably seen the most common form of still life where there's like drawings and paintings of fruit. Kind of boring sometimes maybe, but basically a still life is a drawing or painting of inanimate objects, so objects that are not alive, right? So we're setting up objects and things in an interesting format that we would then draw or paint. The workload for this project will be divided up weekly, which I've talked about in our course description last week. Here's a couple of different examples of some still lifes. This is a more traditional one, right? Like you've got this painting of this glass bottle and some apples. You see this a lot in art history, um, and just like in museums and things, you'll see a lot of still lifes of things like this. Um, on either side of these, you've got more modern still life paintings, so paintings that were made more recently. And these ones are of more, what I would say, more interesting things, or things that more people would be familiar with like today. So you've got this interesting still life painting of an empty ice cream. I think a few of us have seen the empty ice cream before, the bottom of that after having a long day. And then you've got this really interesting um, duck still life. I don't know who decided that drawing rubber duckies was a fun idea, but I like it. So um, okay, let's jump into what we're going to be doing this week. So the ultimate goal for this week is to, one, pick objects that we want to paint, and two, figure out a way that we can organize them in a visually interesting way so that we can later actually paint them. Okay. So a couple of things that we're going to be learning this week. We're going to be learning about rough draft sketches or research, like the groundwork for starting a painting. A lot of us might think that like you can just get your painting paper and just start. And while some people do that, 90% of the time, all artwork is planned. Like you come with resources and ideas, and you have rough drafts before you even start your final. This is something that I teach all of my students, regardless of what art class it is. Even if it's like a design class like yearbook, those of you that have had me for yearbook are going to be familiar with this. There's a process that we have to learn to help us get ready for the actual final piece. This is similar with everything you do in life, right? Like you don't just go to a basketball team having not done any practice and expect to actually like win the game or be halfway decent, right? You have to do a bunch of workouts. You have to do a bunch of practice, learn the routines, learn some plays. You have to be able to work with your fellow teammates, right? Like basically what I'm trying to sum up is that there are what I would call art push-ups, art workouts. There's things that we can do to help improve our skills and also get an idea of what we're going to do before we actually do it. So what that's going to entail for this particular project is we are going to look at some instructional videos that teach us about what other artists do when they set up a still life, like strategies that have been proven to look good. You could call these what we would call like compositional rules. Composition is just a fancy word for organization. So how things are organized. A composition is basically just a fancy word for this is how I organize this. Now, when I say rules, I don't want you to get all like, ugh, gross. I don't like art is supposed to be free and you can do whatever you want. Now, that can be true, but there are certain things that we can follow, certain strategies that we can follow to improve our artwork. Now, does that mean that we have to use those every single time? Absolutely not. There are perfectly okay ways to break the rules and still have really interesting artwork. And we'll talk a little bit about that today and how we can do that specifically even for this project. But we're first going to learn about some proven like compositional strategies for organizing our still lifes, as well as learning how we could potentially be more creative and break some of those rules. So with that, let's take a look at we're going to have a couple of videos on this slide and on the next slide. Both of these two videos will go over some of those rules. What are some proven methods for organizing objects that make them look nice? Now, before we watch this together, I am aware that when we stream a video through Zoom that it doesn't always work the best. So here's what I want to like just warn you beforehand, that if for some reason as we're watching this together, if it doesn't really work for you, There'll be plenty of time at the end of class that like you all have access to this in discussion too. You can just watch it on your own. It's super short and you can skip through parts if you need to, but don't get too worried if you don't like if it doesn't work for you. Okay. There's like actual photo examples that we're going to talk about, and it will kind of sum up what we discuss in this video. So don't worry too much if this doesn't work as well for you, but we're going to watch this. You'll notice that it says still life photography. So there are a lot of different kinds of art that use still life, that make still lifes, and photography happens to be one of them. But just because this particular artist is a photographer and he isn't talking about painting specifically, these rules still apply to drawing, painting, collage, whatever kind of method you are using to create a still life. These are really good rules to follow. So we're going to watch this. He's going to give us a bunch of different ideas, and then we're going to talk about it for a little bit. Oh, hold on. I want to watch the video. There we go.
Still life photography is about making interesting compositions out of everyday objects, but it's the way that you arrange and frame these objects up that really makes all the difference. Now in this video, I'm going to give you a few tips on creating still life compositions, and I'm going to share with you my favorite composition structure. It's just one that seems to always work for me. So we're going to get to that, but first we're going to talk about some of the other rules of composition, and we're going to start with the rule of thirds. Now the rule of thirds is pretty well known, and it applies to most forms of visual art, maybe even all types of visual art. But the rule is generally about two things. One, if you divide the scene into a grid like this, this divides the scene into three major vertical areas and three major horizontal areas. Now these lines create intersection points, and it's these points that are good spots to place a focal point in your image. Two, the rule of thirds also suggests that any horizon in your image line up with one of the horizontal lines.
Okay, now, before we get too far ahead, now obviously when you're looking at stuff, right, you don't have this like grid on top of your eyes that you're going to be seeing the world with, right? But if you could visualize what you're looking at, all he's trying to say is that basically if you put like your tallest object or your biggest object more to one side than the other, it creates an interesting composition by making it so that it's basically not symmetrical. Basically, this strategy is creating a way to have interesting compositions that don't put your objects directly in the middle. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't put things directly in the middle, and we'll talk about that kind of strategy in a minute, but this is one way that you can organize stuff. Doesn't mean it's always the best way. It's just one way that you can play around with.
On the grid. This is supposed to discourage you from placing your horizon in the middle of the scene. You can apply the same principle to any taller vertical object in your scene. You just place that vertical object on one of the vertical grid lines. And really what all this does is shift the balance of your composition to one side so that things are visually heavier in 1/3 of the image and a little lighter in the other 2/3. Now this and a good use of negative space is what helps get the viewer's eye to move around the scene and toward the focal point. Lining things up this way can be much more interesting than, just putting something dead center in a scene. Now, it might be easy enough to visualize where these grid lines are supposed to appear when you're looking through your viewfinder, but some cameras have this cool feature that superimposes the grid into your viewfinder or on.
Now, again, this isn't a photography class, but we're going to be, after we're done with this lesson, you're going to get the opportunity to actually start setting up your stuff. There's two ways that we can approach this. You can actually take a photo of the objects that you set up And if you're using a phone, a lot of your phones will actually have this setting to put a grid on your phone while you're taking the picture. And this will help you kind of organize things following this rule of thirds pattern where you're putting objects on these intersecting points and your bigger one more to one side. Okay. There will be another way that you can do this where you can just sketch your ideas like from life rather than setting them up and photographing them. But so long as you do have a camera or a phone with a camera, this is a really good method for like playing around with organizing your objects, because then you'll be able to print the photo and use that photo as a reference to like paint from, especially since most of us have siblings or animals that might potentially move around where we where we set up our still life, and you want the still life to be something that's going to look the same every time you try and paint it, rather than have something that accidentally bumps into it.
On the back of your camera on your LCD screen. Now this one's pretty easy. It's the rule of odds. And all the rule of odds is suggesting is that an odd number of objects is more interesting to look at than an even number of objects. Now how you apply this rule, of course, is up to you, but I think the main idea behind it is that you're trying to avoid things looking too symmetrical in your image. Leading lines, now these are areas of an image that help guide the viewer's eye to other areas of the image. Now I find that in still lifes, leading lines are a little more subtle than they would be in other types of images. The way that you group objects in a scene can help the viewer understand their relationship to each other. Keep in mind that the way that you group things can either cause tension or create harmony within that scene. Now, you might have heard of the S curve or the S shape in composition. Well, the L-shaped structure is something that I really like. This is probably my favorite composition structure, and I'll tell you why. The L-shaped structure makes it easy to build a still life along a horizontal plane. And it fits nicely with what the rule of thirds is essentially trying to accomplish. So really what you're trying to do is you start with your taller object on one of the vertical grid lines on one side of the image, and then you build up the rest of the supporting objects along the base. And then what you get is an L-shaped composition.
Okay, so this is the last one from the video that we're going to talk about. But basically, it's an extension to the rule of thirds where you have your bigger object or your taller object to one side, and then the rest of the objects are kind of in line with it, making an L shape. And that's it. Pretty easy, not too hard. It's one way of making things. It's not always the best way, but it's something to experiment with and play around because it can create some interesting ideas. This video you can watch on your own time. It's just ideas on how you can use some stuff that most people will have at their house and how you could set up an interesting backdrop using tablecloths and paper. So this is useful if you are having a hard time picking objects. This can kind of show you what you can do with everyday just stuff that everyone should probably have. Okay, so let's get to what we're going to be working on today, which is using some of the strategies from the video, as well as some others that I'm going to show you in a minute, and actually practicing organizing our objects using those strategies. Let's just quickly sum up what we learned from the video. One of the main ones from the video was using the rule of thirds, which suggests mostly like trying to avoid having things be in the middle and putting more of our objects more to one side or the other, whether that be you're using this L-shaped format where you put your taller images on one side and then all the rest of the smaller ones in a line next to it, creating this L shape. Or this one doesn't really make an L shape, but it's just more of like your bigger objects are on one side and it kind of creates contrast or emphasis on one side, leaving empty space over here. Okay, so that's one way. They didn't talk about this in the video, but I still think it's a really interesting and it's an easy way of organizing things. Symmetry is often really beautiful, and it's definitely an interesting way to explore organizing your objects. So symmetry is obviously just by looking at it, it's where you can draw a line halfway in between or anywhere. Basically, it just means that your objects are mirrored on one side, right? Like it's like almost exactly the same or close to exactly the same on each side. Um, what I like about, for example, in particular with this one on the right, is that not only it does it have symmetry, but it's from a different perspective. Normally you see still lifes like from face on, like things that are directly in your face. But this one is from like a looking down perspective, right? So you don't have to think of still lifes as just something that's always right in front of us. You can think of different perspectives, like maybe right above or maybe slightly below or different angles, right? But play around with different perspectives because it can create interesting compositions. But symmetry is another way that you can organize objects. Then obviously, breaking the rules. Sometimes just experimenting and just putting stuff where you feel like it feels best is an interesting way for organizing stuff. Or just like thinking about objects, how they would like naturally occur in their habitat or wherever they're located, right? Like for example, this one right here, this just looks like a jar of candy fell over. It doesn't look like someone meticulously put these candies in that specific location, right? Like this one looks like something just fell over. And that can create interesting, like a more interesting feeling, a more interesting composition, to have things just be more random or something that you experiment with where you're not concerned with trying to follow any rules. I think the reason this one with the oranges is more interesting is like the shape that this peel makes. Like I think technically you could say and argue that this is making an L shape kind of thing, right? But honestly, I think it's more of just kind of in line with this more naturally occurring. You've got this really cool swirly shape, um, but they're not necessarily focused on any of the rules. It's just something that looks interesting. So, for what you are going to be doing and what I'm requiring as far as the work is that I want you, the end goal is to have either a rough sketch or an actual just photo of 3 different formats of organizing your objects that you pick. So step 1 would be to pick the objects. Step 2 would be to experiment with 3 different methods that I'm going to require you to do. I want you to do one rule of thirds or L format. They're basically the same. So one rule of thirds, one symmetrical one, and one basically a freebie where you just are experimenting however you'd like. So that's a total of 3 different ideas. You can either sketch them out, just like you do little rough draft ideas of where you're going to put all the objects, or what I would suggest is you're actually just taking photos of your objects in these 3 different ideas, experimenting with them so that you have photo references that you could actually then later use to paint. Okay, so I would suggest after you've picked your objects, experiment with organizing them in like an L shape or having them like the taller object be more on one side than or on the other, and then try and organize it so that like you have objects that are symmetrical. Now you can have a more symmetrical layout without it being perfectly the same on either side. You could have what I would call symmetry in like the amount of space. Like if you had a bowl over here with different fruits and different things in here, but it was still the same shape and took up the same space, I would still say that that's a symmetrical layout, even if it's not perfectly symmetrical. Does that make sense? So you could still have a more symmetrical layout without having it be perfectly the same on each side, so long as the objects took up the same amount of space. And then again, you can just experiment for the last one. So right here, this will take you to a link of some examples of different ways that you could get like what you could submit as far as like photos or even rough draft sketches of your stuff. So if you don't have a camera and you don't want to worry about taking pictures, load. You could submit little thumbnail rough draft sketches like this of your different compositions. They don't even need to be maybe quite as detailed as these, but notice that they're from different perspectives of the same objects, but you could also just photograph your work. This I would say has probably more objects than you like. I would probably limit myself to 5 objects and I would have no less than 3. You need to have at least 3 objects. Now, really quickly, what I'm going to do, I've got a table over here with a couple of things. Here's what I would suggest. I am you, and I have this assignment where I'm setting up my still life. I would find a place where you can set up your objects on a flat surface, and I would experiment first with just one of the different strategies, whether it be the symmetrical one or the rule of thirds, doesn't matter what one, but experiment with setting that up. And then after you've got that set up, I would get my camera or phone out, and I would get down and first start taking photos where it's like level with the objects, and try a couple of different angles. You could experiment with some that are like above your table. But before you even experiment with taking photos of your stuff, for example, this camera is really interesting. It would be something that would be interesting to have in a painting or a still life. But look at how many things are like on this and how complicated that would be. Is this something that would be easy to paint? Probably not, right? So pay attention to that first. Pick objects that you would feel comfortable painting. Now for this class, since it's not a drawing class, I am going to allow you to use your photo that you take of your still life to actually trace onto your painting paper for this project. Okay. I am more concerned with the painting process that we're going to be learning in the next couple of weeks. And I'm less interested in how well you can draw at this point. We're going to do a little bit of drawing lessons because in order to paint, you kind of need to understand some basic drawing concepts in order to then paint in your drawing, right? So naturally there will be some drawing in this class, but specifically for this one, I'm more concerned with you learning some painting techniques. So after we've finished this portion where we take photos or do little rough draft sketches of our ideas for the different strategies that I'm teaching you, I will allow you to actually trace your stuff. So that's why I'm saying it is important to understand the object's difficulty in painting. Even if it might be technically more difficult to draw, you will be able to trace it. And if it's something that's still not going to be terribly too hard to paint, I would say that that would be an okay object for you to use for your still life. Now, another thing that will help you pick objects, I would encourage you to use themes for your still life. Like, say you're really interested in sports, like you're on the volleyball team or you're on the basketball team. Maybe you make a still life that use objects that all relate to basketball, right? Like you've got a basketball and some basketball shoes and maybe like a jersey or something, and you can organize those in an interesting way. Maybe you want to do like fast food, like that would be an interesting still life. Now that, for example, anything with food would we highly encourage to do the photo route of setting up your still life, because you're not going to want to set up like a burger and some fries and stuff for over a week or two for you to paint, because that's going to go bad and it's going to smell really awful and your mom's going to hate me, right? But you could set up a still life of some fast food or just regular food, take a bunch of cool pictures of it for each of the different strategies, and then eat it, right? And then you've already got your documentation and your photos that you can use for the project. Does that make sense? Okay, so your goal is, ideally, you're not going to necessarily get your super awesome symmetrical photo and your super awesome rule of thirds photo and freestyle photo all in one shot. You're probably going to need to set things up, take several photos until you get one that you're really happy with, then reset it up in the different a different strategy, take several photos of it, eventually get one really good one, reset it up one more time, and go through that process so that you probably end up taking about 30 photos and get 3 really good ones, one for each of the strategy. Does that make sense to everybody?
So we just take like photos after our like still life, or
Yeah,
do
so
we
for
need to
now,
take a photo
we
and draw?
are experimenting with the organization of our setup. And I just realized that I think my screen was still shared when I was trying to show you what was on my table, huh? You probably didn't even see my face. But I would first pick your objects and then experiment with, I think the easiest one would be the symmetrical layout. So think of ways that you can make an organization of your objects in a symmetrical way, taking photos of it, and then reorganize it in the rule of thirds, take some photos of it, and then one where you just play around with whatever kind of organization you want, take photos of it, and then submit your one best photo for each one. So that's 3 total. And that's all let's do at the end of the week, is just having your still life setup done. Okay.
Do we just submit it to the discussion too?
Yep, in discussion 2. That's where it's going. If you don't want to do the photo route and you would rather just set it up and then draw your ideas from it, you can do that as well. You could just have it set up at your table, have a sketchbook, and do, like, if I was doing this where I've got this camera and film roll, I would worry more about just like the overall shape of it, not all the little details, just a really quick drawing of where things are located, and that's it. I wouldn't worry too much about details. But that's why I'm suggesting the photo route, because you could potentially end up actually using your photo for your project. You could actually use the photo to paint from the photo. Okay, let's go through the discussion. Can I leave the Zoom because I went over this? Yeah, Gwen, this is a repeat class. You're free to go. What type of photo? How many items? Okay, so Ruby asked about like types of photos or how many items. I would use 3 to 5. That's what I would play around with. I wouldn't use less than 3 and I wouldn't use more than 5. Can I do a still life on a place in my house, like my room? Yes, so you could like find a naturally occurring thing where objects are already set up, but I would still take pictures of it. And I would still follow the rule of not doing more than 3 or not more than 5 objects and not less than 3. So if you like found something really interesting in your kitchen that had like a cool setup of, like, you have this really cool basket of fruit or something that you wanted to do, you could do that. Again, though, I still wouldn't like draw something that has necessarily more than 5 or 6 things in it. And you're still wanting to try and the requirement is you're experimenting with these 3 strategies we learned. So even if you do a place that's in your house, you still have to like organize your camera and objects in a way that you are still following rule of thirds once, you're doing symmetry once, and then you can play around freestyle for your last one. What if my painting stuff is in my locker? You won't need your painting stuff this week. So right now we're just setting up our still life. You will definitely need your painting stuff next week. So if it's in your locker, then you're perfectly ready to go for next week. Would we turn it in tomorrow if we don't have... Oh, if you're sketching it, would you turn it in tomorrow if we don't have a photo? No, you'll turn it in at the same time. You can turn it in early. If you want to turn things in early, you're more than welcome to. It makes it so that I can like look at it earlier and give you feedback. So the earlier you turn things in, the more likely you are to get feedback where I'm like, hey, that looks good, you're done. Or, oh, you should experiment with this a little bit more, and then resubmit. So if you ended up sketching your ideas, they're still due the same day as if you took it from a photo and if you went the photo route. So either your photo idea or your sketch idea is due this Saturday. I think that's all the questions I'm seeing in the chat, but are there any other questions? Okay, you are free to go at this point if you would like to start experimenting and taking pictures of your still life setups or sketching your ideas, whichever route you end up taking. This lesson has been